Liebling. I'm a Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Cambridge, and I'm interviewing Susanne Karstedt. Susanne is a Professor of Criminology in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Griffith University, where she's been since 2015. She previously held chairs in criminology at the University of Leeds and at Kiel, which she joined after leaving her native Germany behind. In Germany, she held positions at the universities of Bielefeld and Hamburg. She's researched and written widely on comparative issues in crime and justice, including democracy, crime, violence, justice, corruption and punishment. And she's created 2 global data sets, one on prison conditions and one on violent societies. Her other work focuses on morality, trust and the role of emotions in criminal justice, particularly transitional justice. She's co-founder and co-chair of the European Criminology Group on Atrocity Crimes and Transitional Justice, and her historical work on these themes covers post-war Germany, and she's recently developed a more comparative perspective. She's presently working on using the evidence base of criminology for prevention and intervention in mass atrocities. Suzanne's work has been recognised by several awards, including the International Award of the Law and Society Association, the Thorsten Sellin and Eleanor and Sheldon Gluck Award of the American Society of Criminology, and the Christa Hoffmann Reim Award for Socio-Legal Studies from the German Law and Society Association. So, Susanne, take us back to the beginning of this journey, your intellectual and also your life journey. When did criminology first appear in your sightline, and where did it come from? So what's your disciplinary background?
My disciplinary background is sociology, and it all starts very early when I descended into the library of the Department of Sociology at the University of Hamburg, and there were books that were really, really interesting. They were mostly in English, but there were also some German books on topics like offenders, young offenders. So I encountered McCord's and McCord's Summer Youth Study, which left a huge impression on me. And I think they had also Staatsanwalt. They're quite dusty volumes, but I found it absolutely amazing. And there were also German. There was also German literature, in particular, let us say, the psychoanalytic Vienna school, Eichinger and so on, which later translated, for example, in Erikson's work. There are also some other authors about which I learned much later that they had been deeply involved, quite involved, in the Nazi regime. I learned that only in the 1990s, and that gave me the feeling as if I had walked over very thin ice, and there was kind of abyss below, which I had not recognized. And I thought, my God, have you been influenced by their thoughts? Because these books were from the 1940s and early 1950s. Yeah, so there was an early intellectual engagement with these topics. And I also had a teacher and later mentor, Professor, at that time not Professor, Lieselotte Pongratz. Lieselotte Pongratz had studied at the Mannheim Center of the London School of Economics in the early 1950s and had brought back a lot of ideas. And she engaged our students in a kind of project on a halfway house that was established at the time. And she became a lifelong friend and mentor for me. She was an activist, so she was actually, she was the kind of ombudsman for the prisoners in Hamburg. And went to prison. She was a fierce and courageous woman, something I never could master in that way. But she was a good model, even if I did not follow completely. So these were very early starts in criminology.
Yeah, so these were your early starts. How did they take you to where you've ended up, or where you've spent most of your intellectual life?
Let me say, I don't have the usual academic career. So I'm a model of you can make it nonetheless. And after my studies, I joined the Lufthansa for 2 years in the Human Resources Department as a sociologist. And then from there I became an assistant professor in the Faculty of Sociology at the University of Bielefeld in its department on social problems and social control. And that is where I then started my work on knowledge of law. That was survey work. I later conducted and directed a large project on diversion and young offenders in a special research unit of the German Research Foundation. And then, I was hooked with crime and criminology. Now in Germany, as many Germans and others know, social scientists are not welcome in the law faculty as criminologists. So with very few exceptions, the criminologists in Germany are lawyers, and I was not willing to get a law degree. So I realized that I had to leave the country. Right. And I started an international, to prepare an international career. And I started to apply for jobs, and I was very fortunate that in 2000 I got this chair at Kiel University. And Kiel University was absolutely wonderful. It was such a warm welcome. It was such a wonderful intellectual atmosphere with discussions and ideas flowing and floating around. I mean, you know them, Richard Sparks, Ian Loader were there, Tim Hope. So even if we somewhere quarrelsome sometimes a bit, we all stuck together and we started to get European funding. And then I think they started my career off. Right. That was the real start in Kiel. Yeah. They nourished me, they helped me, they started my networks, so I will be forever grateful to them. Right. Then I went to Leeds into a law school, which was interesting in many ways, and I could pursue my work there. And then I was asked whether I would consider to come to Australia, and I said yes, I would, and so I ended up there in 2015.
So you're telling a lot of your history very quickly. Can I slow you down a little bit? And how did you, perhaps it happened when you were at Kiel, but it sounds like you had the instincts very strongly in you before. How did you find your way to democracy, values and violence? That seems to be the sort of theme that's attracted you. How did that start?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, it was clear to me when I came to the UK that I had no chance to catch up with my colleagues on the arcane British justice system. So I thought my area would be comparative work. Yeah. And of course, it was at that time, it was what was called the third wave of democratization. You know, this is the end of history now, and it all will be fine. And of course, that left a number of questions for crime and justice. And I think I also started to think about the values. Because there was a movement in Germany that where people said that individualism increased violence. And I'm an empiricist, so I said, I will check that. Let us see. And I checked it, and it was more what Durkheim had predicted, that individualism actually brings violence down. And I think from there I started to think about, okay, what kind of institutional environment is it that where such individualistic values and egalitarian values flourish? And that was, of course, democracy. So I think from there I made the move towards the question of democracy.
Yes.
It rather came through the values of democracy than through the institutions. And of course, the question of I think the question of values is much more important here, both for crime or violence, but also for punishment.
Yes.
Because the oldest of the modern democracies, the US, has a huge amount of prisoners, has one of the highest imprisonment rates, so that raises a lot of questions. And they are so egalitarian, they are rather egalitarian, they're very individualistic. How do they do this, and why do they do this? How can they fit that to their values, which they have?
Such interesting questions. And the other distinctive thing about your work, if I may say so, is your methodology. Where did that come from? You do have a very strong empirical background. You address questions of values, but you address them empirically. And this is not easy. How did that sort of characteristic of your work develop?
I think I was always a very skeptical person. My father tells a story that when he walked along with me as a 2-year-old and 2 women overtook us who were gossiping, so I turned around and said, "Is that really true?" So I think this is a kind of innate approach to the world. And I found then that, or at the time when I studied, it was de rigueur to have let us say, very good education on epistemology and science and so on, and philosophy of science, with all the debate about Popper, Habermas, and so on going on. And so I was, and with this skeptical mind, I really also think that we are failing very often. So, and I thought I need a methodology that tells me when I'm wrong. And I found that methodology more in quantitative methods rather than in qualitative methods. And I think that was the quote that Mike also put in when I said, I think qualitative researchers are never wrong. Or I haven't found anyone.
Okay, and it's also interesting that, of course, you've lived and worked in 3 different countries, and I wonder if you've noticed or thought about what the relationship might have been between the 3 different countries you've lived in and your intellectual development. Is there a relationship between the place you work and what you work on?
I think there is a deep connection. Of course, the first deep connection is to my own home country, Germany. I grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust, and from a very early age on, I think I was aware of these things. And so I think that, and that raised then, when I studied that, very soon raised the question, how is this possible? How do normal people make these decisions? So I was not that much interested in, let us say, people who have huge offenders, who have huge difficulties in their lives and so on. But I was much more interested in how normal people start to commit crimes, and this in a kind of way links my work on atrocity crimes and on middle class crime, because this question, it also shaped my approach to criminology, because I think, together with your colleague Per Olof, that this is about moral decision making. And of course it relates also to your work. The moral performance of prisons. When you called me and asked me whether that was the right title, I thought, my God, this is the right thing to do. Looking for moral decisions everywhere, even when normal people don't think they are. And of course these are moral decisions. So I think my approach to criminology has been very much shaped by my home country,
Yes.
where I stayed also quite long in my life. In the UK, what I learned there was, let us say, the wonderful way of discussion. And for me, new approach to political argument. Because I thought that British criminology was much more politicized than German one, or at least much more openly. It was much more divisive. There were all these who were labeled administrative criminologists and so on. Finally, my colleagues Richard Sparks and Ian Loder came up with the ultimate labeling of their colleagues. And I thought that was very, very, that impressed me. I mean, that was something completely new to me. And but also the openness of the debate, and also the, let us say, the curiosity, the intellectual curiosity that my English colleagues brought to their work. And this was something that I had not seen in Germany in that way, this kind of, let us have fun, let us sit down and think. This attitude, Germans would not do that. They would say, let us sit down and think and produce our thoughts while speaking, which is actually a quote. And so this was something really nice and new for me. And in Australia has shaped me through a person on the one hand. This was John Braithwaite. I met John Braithwaite in the early 1990s, and we had a lot of discussions about restorative justice and shaming. So I brought, actually I made him more familiar with Elias' work and so on, and also the criticism that was available only in German of Elias' work. And so we had a lot of discussions. But what I learned from him was having the cake and eat it. That is, the German attitude is mainly being very skeptical, criticizing everything. There is nothing that is good. You can't do anything. So it was the nothing works attitude, which was pervasive, in particular in the more left-wing criminology in Germany. And John would have nothing of it. So what I learned from him was actually a much more optimistic outlook, an outlook on criminology. Yes, we can do things, we can change things, we need evidence, we need good thinking, but it's not that nothing works, and it is not our task to tell this again and again and again. So I owe to John this perhaps Australian, more optimistic outlook on our discipline. And now coming to Australia, really, I see that in my young colleagues who are very engaged in changing things, in also curious, finding out what can we do, but also with a much more practical approach, much more applied approach. So that's what, but I think at the moment I'm just observing that. I try to become part of that. But I think the main Australian influence was actually John Braithwaite.
Yes, interesting.
And you, of course, the regulatory network.
Yes, I was going to ask you if there were other mentors. You've now mentioned two. So mentors have been important individuals in your development. Yeah,
so I first mentioned Lieselotte Pongratz. We became good friends, and there are a lot of women who were my mentors, given the fact that they were far and few between at the time. I mean, Lieselotte Pongratz later became the third woman professor of criminology in Germany, and the first one who was not a lawyer. So that happened only at a reform faculty in Hamburg. So she was the first mentor who brought me actually to the topic. And the second one was John McCord, whom I met in the early 1990s. And we started our relationship actually through art, because when I met her, I said I would go to New York afterwards, and she said, you need to go to the Matisse exhibition. And I said, I already have tickets. And that convinced her that I was a worthwhile companion. And she was a harsh trainer, you know. First, I remember a day in Madrid when we started at 10 in one museum and we hadn't finished by 6 o'clock. She was at the time, I think, 68, 69 or something like that. And I was shattered and she was going strong. But she brought the same attitude to work. So she was really, really in questioning you. So why are you doing this? Why do you think that? And so on. And it was like being put on a hot spot and having to answer that. She was very sharp and smart. The third woman whom I would say was a mentor, I think she was not really a mentor, but she supported me, obviously. I think that was Pat Carlin, who brought me to the editorial board of the British Journal of Criminology, which I greatly enjoyed. And she also has been a friend since then. I think I have a funny relationship with my mentors. I admire them deeply, but I don't do what they do.
Yeah. And since you're on the topic of gender, do you have any reflections on, is it significant in your professional life and identity that you're a woman? Do you think it shaped your experiences?
I'm pretty sure it shaped my experiences. But, and of course there are a number perhaps of war stories, you know, when you thought, oh my God, you know. Just one example of this. I went to a conference in, I think it was 1988 or 87 in Germany, which Hans-Jürgen Kleiner organized. And I came a little bit late. And I thought, so I would like to, where is the program and where are the sessions taking place? And the woman looked at me and said, the ladies' program has just started. So they had an extra program for
the ladies.
The ladies. And I said, I'm not here for the ladies' program, sorry. So, but I think it can't compare with your experiences.
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
So I have to ask you this question. What do you feel most proud of in your work?
I think that I feel very proud of that I'm questioning established normative things. So I'm proud of that. I asked, for example, the question, is legitimacy of police and justice better in democracies or in autocratic, authoritarian states? And nobody had asked that question. And when I presented my results, which didn't show that democracy was always better, people were absolutely, they couldn't believe it. Right. They said I had to change my concepts of legitimacy. And so these are things that I am proud of, that I'm questioning that. I know that's not always the best thing to do, but I really like questioning these established knowledge, and of course then bring evidence, whether it's true or whether it is not true. Another thing of which I'm proud of is that comparison between, that actually started my engagement with transitional justice, the comparison between the looking back at the past and in Germany 2 times, so one after 1945, and I got I dug up original data, original survey data, and then I compared that to what happened after 1989, the fall of the wall. So dealing with the past twice. I think that was
Yeah.
I look back at that as quite important work. And what I'm also a bit proud of my my work on prison conditions, because I developed this quantitative. I was not the first to do that. There was one predecessor, but I have now the largest and most up-to-date database on prison conditions worldwide, and I think this is something that we can use for telling really good stories about how prisons look around the world.
Yeah.
The final thing I'm proud of is that I try to relate in a way socio-legal studies and criminology. I think at the moment this justice part of criminology is a little bit neglected. Everybody looks to victims and offenders and situational crime prevention and the incidents, which has a victim and an offender, but what happens afterwards? Like you, so your research on prison, I'm very interested in the justice process. And I think it's very important that criminologists do not lose sight of the justice part of their work, because I think there we can say a lot. We have a lot to say. And we can engage, and we can engage in changing things. We can't. It's very hard to change. I think. How we build or victims and perpetrators, but that is our area where we can make an impact and where we should make an impact.
So it's interesting because you're both a skeptic and an optimist in many ways. Your skepticism is very good for your research methods, but your optimism is very good for taking you into places that perhaps some others haven't trodden.
Yeah, and for example, my recent work, which I do with Tiffany Bergin on the reduction of mass imprisonment in the US, which really happened. I was one of the first to write it actually in the ESC newsletter, that there had been a change. And people came and said, no, it won't change. And they were in the US and they were also here. So you are over-optimistic. But it has slowly goes on. It has a foothold now. The process is developing. So I think this is very optimistic. The skepticism comes in, for example, in my work on transitional justice. Here we have a lot of over-optimistic, normative, normative demands on transitional justice. It should heal, it should heal trauma, it should bring peace, it should bring democracy and all that. Nobody would ask, as Ian Loader once put it absolutely brilliantly, the police in Britain is not asked to promote democracy. Why elsewhere? And I think that was an interesting and good question. So I think that my skepticism comes in and I say, okay, transitional justice is justice. So, and it comes with all the limitations, and we should not expect more from it than what we expect from justice normally. Of course, we have expectations to justice, but certainly not peace, not healing every trauma, and doing all the good and transforming offenders on the spot. You know that. It's a long and hard road. So I think we should think of the limitations of justice much more.
So that brings us to your current work, and you've talked a little bit about your current interests, but do you want to say a bit more about where your interests are taking you now? Where are your energies? Unfortunately, at the moment, too many things going. So, where am I going? Because of my
let us say, journey through countries, I have mainly published on my own. And what I have recently discovered was working with others.
Yeah.
And collaborating with others in publications, which I do at the moment a bit more than I did before. I think if I go back to what I'm proud of, it's also that together with Ian Loda, actually at the time in Kiel, and Willem de Haan, when I came to Kiel, I already had the topic of emotions, crime and justice in my head, and then I met Ian and Willem, who were editing something on that, and I said, yes, I can join you. So this topic, emotions in crime and justice, that will be for the next years one of the main topics.
Right. And
in particular, again, how does that work? For example, Manuel with revenge.
Yes.
Yeah. And how do emotions work in institutions? How are they constrained? How are they channeled? I mean, criminal justice is a place where emotions are seething. Yeah, we have to acknowledge that, but they are also channeling us. And also, if Manuel does revenge, I would always tell him yes, but we also have the emotions of forgiving. We can do that. It's not only the biology of revenge, we also need the other stuff.
Yeah.
So this is something that I will certainly bring to the future. Another project is finally to find out more about the evidence of what transitional justice does.
Yeah,
so a kind of systematic analysis of that. And a little bit of coming together. I'm doing a book on democracy, crime and justice. So bringing my thoughts together there, renewing them, thinking perhaps a bit more about what holds crime, democracy and justice, democracy together, and where might be the links between these two topics.
Right.
So I think these are things that I would like to do, and this is where my work takes me.
Sounds like you've got plenty to keep
busy. And less and less time. Less and less time to do so.
And what about criminology and the European Society of Criminology? What's the role? How do you see the role of the European Society of European Criminology at this time?
I think that partially the question is about, is it different from the US? And
yes.
I would certainly say yes.
Can you say how?
Definitely yes, because much of the continent criminology is still law driven. I have worked in law faculties, you are working in a law faculty, but they take us in. This is not the case in countries like Germany, or slowly it changes. So I first was inclined to see this as a disadvantage in contrast to the US with its thriving social science, psychological and so on approaches. I tend more and more to see it as an asset now, because it brings much more to the European scene the questions of human rights, justice, processes, procedures, than perhaps in American criminology. And I think this is a good thing. And I can see, so the relationship to socio-legal study, the bridges there are much stronger than, for example, in the US, where it's completely taken apart. So you have Law and Society Association and the criminologists. So this is something I really think what European criminology can bring. I think they also should put their foot down a bit, because at the moment we have, and I meet young people from the up and coming Asian criminology who always tell me about criminology in the West, and this is only the US. So I tell them that actually criminology was invented in Europe and not that much in the US. So I think the European Society has actually quite a role also in reaching out to those other parts of the world that are much more influenced by European ways. Also Latin America, I think, is something where international relations should be strengthened. So I think that is, I think that's the way how I see they differ.
So in a way you're calling for greater visibility of the European Society.
Yes, I think that they should not think that they need to emulate US criminology. They have own approaches, they have own ways of thinking, and perhaps they also, and I would like to see in journals also, let us say, some more ways of thinking, intellectual engagement, in the way of how the French intellectuals, for example, something like that.
Okay. So we're starting to talk about the future. You're now doing your criminology in Griffith in Australia, but you spend quite a lot of time with your colleagues in the UK. How would you like to see our field develop? You've touched on the role of justice and criminologists paying more attention to justice. Do you have any thoughts about how you'd like to see our field develop?
I think the good thing, what I really like about criminology, and I love criminology. So I think actually when I talk to you about how it all began in this dusty library or in the University of Hamburg, I think I was pretty immediately hooked by these topics. And I was I did not like when, for example, in the 1970s and 1980s, people said, oh yeah, criminology should go. We should have a regulatory science, like John Braithwaite said, or Stan Cohen said, we should forget about it, it was something bad. And I was completely opposed to this, because I thought, and obviously I was also right, because criminology thrived and it was anything but abandoned or putting on the dust heap of history or anything like that. So I think it has been thriving over the past years. And what I like about it is it's multidisciplinary. Criminology for me is a very thriving, very vibrant discipline, if we can say it's a discipline. What I like about it is its multidisciplinarity. And so many disciplines feeding into it. So I like, for example, also history. So the historical branches, so what Manuel does, Manuel Eisner does, and I'm actually also involved in a large project on Australian data on prosecution that Mark Finane has collected, and we will do a project together on the reduction of violence in Australia starting in 1830, which is of course a great project. So history comes in. Then on the other hand we have neuroscience coming in, which certainly will change our field in some ways. I think we don't know yet what it will do, how it will develop, but these are, I think these are from the arts, humanities side, but also from the other side. In my field, there is of course an interdisciplinary relationship between political science and criminology, which I think has been also neglected. And I think this, I mean, in criminal justice, in your field, punishment, penalty, there we have a lot of political scientists, but for example, in my field on violence, atrocities, so political institutions have not been part of the criminological discussion, and I would like to bring in political science a little bit more. And there is one more project which I would really like to do, political scientists have comparative perspectives to see which policies work. And this is something that is at the moment lacking in criminology. So people who do comparative work like me, this is more or less seen as something nice, but let us say not that much applied or practical. I think if we look at political science, we have there are chances to develop applied. So for example, which countries do better? We have this always this comparison with Norwegian prisons, which Ben now does. The question is really much better. Or other institutions or police institutions. I think there is a lot of, let us say, intellectual fire in using comparative perspectives for evidence, for criminological evidence, or looking at experiments across the world. But I think more of what political scientists do, looking at, for example, different welfare states and see which have the better outcomes, or in development studies and so on. So I would like to bring this thinking to criminology, and I think that might help us to develop things. That is how I think. I'm a little bit reluctant to say where is the future. I know that my young colleagues at Griffith, they are together with I think UCL here in London, about the futures of crime. So what would the crimes of the future look like? I think we don't know, but
too speculative.
But I think worthwhile to do, to see where it will lead us. The other thing is, of course, and I think this is so important, this is about justice and improving justice. And I think we need to go out, we need to go to Africa, improving prisons in Africa or Latin America or Asia, if we can help. And I think this is a very, very important, where European criminology should engage and could engage. And I think I would like to see more of that engagement to improve justice. I mean, we have a lot to do at home. We have a lot of homework to do, there is no question. But also trying to bring what we know, for example, how prisons perform well, and bring that to other countries. Like I think with your work in Latin America now, but also Africa or Tunisia, like your young colleague does.
I have one more question, maybe one and a half. What has challenged you the most when you think about your professional life? And when I say challenge in any way, whether it's challenged you methodologically or personally, that you work in some quite heavy as well as obviously important areas, where have the main challenges lay?
Of course, the topic of atrocity crimes is in many ways challenging. I'm still struck when I read about what perpetrators have to say. I often read books about the history of Germany, how they see that. I think this is very challenging because it shows us how people can be, how institutions shape them, how we can go wrong in our moral decision making, and there are amazing perspectives. For example, if one person who clearly, and there's evidence enough, has been involved in a terrible massacre says, I don't feel like a murderer. Just refusing to accepting that. I think that is a challenge, and I think methodological challenges, that is something that I think we can overcome. And a challenge has always been for comparative work to be accepted,
Right.
I think, or in quantitative work.
Yeah.
So that was mainly in the UK, and where quantitative work was very often very much attacked and seen as shallow and not deep and all that, and I get pretty upset about that.
We're hoping those days are over.
Yes, so I meet that in Australia too.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. So my last half a question is just whether there's anything I haven't asked you or you wish I'd asked you that you want to say about your professional life.
I think I would like to say that because criminology was such a thriving field all over the world, in the US, it has attracted amazing people. It has attracted amazing intellectuals. And I was very lucky, I think, that some of them became friends, and a number of them became friends, and I still enjoy to be in the presence of such wonderful, great people. Yeah, that is a lot of fun in my work, and I'm deeply grateful to how they inspired me, how they led me, and how they supported me. I would like to say that was not only for these people, but also for students, colleagues, and so on. And if I look back at my career, at some point I would never have thought that I could get to this point.
Right.
So I think myself as extremely lucky.
Yes.
And I remember when I was at Kiel and walking to work, I pinched my arm and I couldn't believe that I was now a professor of criminology. Yeah. And so I think I'm a lucky child, if I can say that.
You're a natural collaborator.
Thank you.
I think we have to end there, but thank you so much for talking to us about your professional life, Susanne Karstedt.
Thank you very much for asking these wonderful questions, Alison Liebling.